Hello, this is Alechius, and welcome to Sprocket, the beginning of a tutorial series. Assuming you have purchased the game and you are staring at the splash screen, first thing you're going to want to do, go into settings, get your units to whatever your preferences are. Take note, there is a cheat in here for ignore space limitations for if you're making historical recreations. Gameplay. By default, you use the shift key to go to scope, and you have to hold it down to stay in the scope. I prefer to just swap between. That's what that setting does. Auto reset scope zoom is also selected by default. So when you go out of the scope and go back in, it resets the zoom. I like to have it pretty much zoomed all the way in all the time. The indicator shows a little circle in the center of the screen, and it will blow up and go orange for a penetration, blue for a partial, gray for a ricochet or non-penetrating hit. Budget size to change the size of the battles. Camera settings, or if you feel the need. I didn't feel the need to change any of this. I left everything as default as you see here, but you can change field of vision. If, for instance, you have a 3 monitor or a very large curved monitor, you could set it up for a better field of view that makes more sense. Sensitivities as well. Graphics, I did not change a thing, but make adjustments as needed to get the settings you need for you and your computer. Audio settings, I didn't change other than to shut off the music. And the key mapping makes a good reference, but again, I didn't change anything myself. If you find something more convenient, please do. Things to note are left mouse button to fire, middle mouse button to lock aim. That locks the turret and the elevation in place so that you can maneuver the tank without slewing the turret all over the place. WASD for steering, ignition with I, which I haven't had to use. Gun convergence. I have actually not messed with that. It's 300 meters by default, not just roll with that, but you can adjust the sights. L for lights, important for one mission. So detailed info I haven't used. Attachment. Yeah, that's for all within the editor for turning on and off mirroring, duplicating objects, rotating, scaling. Take note of them. And then command vehicle, command team, cancel order. I have not used any of the command settings as of yet. So there you go. That's the basics of the settings. My next recommendation is to go into faction, create a faction, name it however you want. And the second character, for some reason, always wants to be like, I do not understand this. And it'll do it here as well. There we go. And it will have checked some starter blueprints. I would recommend leaving those for the moment. Then you have a choice of the other settings. You have a showroom, which, oh dear, I have turned off the UI, which is U by default. Showroom, which uses max tech. For your awareness, everything works as normal. And it also has a good view of tanks, decent lighting for shadows, no shadows. There's some dark spots, but a decent overall way to take shots of a tank that you really like. And that makes it useful to know the UI, how to turn off the UI with you. Going to the upper left takes you to the menu. Quit to desktop, quit to main menu, switch faction, settings, and resume. Going back to the main menu. Outside of the showroom, you have the Sandbox, which allows you to load and modify a tank and to test it out on a flat open field. Sandbox, which puts you into a testing field. Has hills, ditches, bumps, slopes that are labeled by their size. Has a dirt trail that goes back that way. Has various widths of trench for testing. It also has exploding barrels. Don't run into those. They are very dangerous. Has a lake, a long strip of road for testing. Overall, just a good area for testing. Do note, pressing Z, as in Z, allows you to spawn in enemies. They are active, or at least they have been previously for me. Wow, this elevates really slowly. And you can test shooting various targets. Interesting. Going back to the menu, you then have the scenarios. Highly, highly recommended for your first tank and for in general. Do dunes, railway, fields, or taiga. Dunes is interwar, railway is early war, fields and taiga are late war. In reverse order, the Crossroad is a special mission against a souped up King Tiger in a hull down position at the end of a windy road that you have to defeat. It's a single enemy tank. Silent Border is a border crossing scenario that has difficulties. It's at night. There's a road to follow. There's enemies to defeat, but it's not a straight up battle, and there are some challenges to that mission that are best handled once you get a better handle on the game. Ambush is probably, well, let's skip that one for the moment. I know the inclination, just as it was mine, is to jump into the game and do the first scenario. Don't do it. No Tanks Land is the Great War scenario and involves making a tank with very basic engine tech to cross trenches, which is a difficult task, cross mud, which is a difficult task, and be armored enough to be able to respond to multiple enemies shooting at it, which is a difficult task. Don't do it. Move to one of the other scenarios first until you get a handle on it, and then go back and hit a No Tanks Land. It is a fun scenario once you get a feel for it, but it is a long slog to learn the game using No Tanks Land. Ambush is probably the one special scenario I would say that's a little bit easier to handle for your first tank. And I'll say go in and we'll do that. I know I have another video where we make a tank from scratch in ambush, but we're going to do something a little bit different because I want to show you how to make your first tank. Now, things to do. Me personally, I like to go to the crew first because I'm going to be counting on that to handle the internal space. What crew do I want? This is probably the minimum for a... Well, let's take it down. If you make a one-man tank, not recommended. The inefficiencies are nuts. Down to 34%. 24 if you had a radio man for the command tasks that we saw in the settings. And they must be in the hull, and there can be no turret. That is a requirement. If you have a turret, the minimum is 2 people in the tank. And you can have that backwards. The efficiencies are fairly poor. You can try moving the loading down to the driver. Don't know how that would work in a real tank, but the driver task must be in the hull. The gunner task must be in the turret, otherwise the tank will not work. Then you get into 3 and 4 4-man tanks. So for a first tank, I recommend a gunner, a loader, a commander, and a driver. 4 people. Maximize the cubic space, 100% efficiency off the board. You lose a commander, you lose half your efficiency. Why are you... There it goes. Sometimes it needs to be... The game is in early access, and sometimes it needs to be reminded of how some of the sliders interact with each other. Things to note elsewhere. You have a whole bunch of things that you can add on. I would not do that yet. You have the essentials. Let me get that on the dirt so it's more readable. Must have 1 driver, 1 gunner, 1 loader, a mantlet for mounting the gun, a driver's port, and a gunner's sight. You will get an error for not having commander's cupola. It is not required, but it makes more sense and doesn't cost you any weight, so why not? Up here you have the internal space in cubic meters for the hull of the tank. If you click on it, you get hull internal space usage. You can see where all of your space is being used. Up here you have the space available in the turret. So we have 4.52 cubic meters and what is using that space. And then we have the weight of the tank. Total mass is 25 3/4 tons, mostly armor. You can see where all of the weight is. Now, I've shown you the basic interface, the recommendations of heading the crew first, and this is how I like to do it. I generally go backwards. Firepower. Now, you don't need to put a mantlet on yet. Note, though, that the light mantlets have 20 millimeters of armor. The medium mantlets have 50 millimeters of armor. The base is slidable, but the mantlet itself, which is this piece right here, the base is this piece, the mantlet is this piece. And the heavy, good grief, is 100 millimeters of armor on the mantlet. So keep that in mind. Without having a mantlet, you can still adjust the gun if you want to see what it looks like. It is sitting in this standardized breech block, which I have a feeling this breech block will change once the developer gets the game a little bit more polished. Right now, just the gun itself will change, but the breech block does not change size to match up things. So I would recommend go to firepower, go to cannon, select, okay, what kind of gun am I going to want? Recommendations for any era from me are the 50 to 60 millimeter range, just to start out. You'll want to use much bigger guns for various reasons, much smaller guns for various reasons. But I have found that there appears to be a local minima for weight and size in the 50 to 60 millimeter caliber range. So I would select that range and then get the penetration value you want. And here's one of the reasons you might want to go with something outside of that range. 59 millimeters of penetration, that's not enough. What about 60? Oh yeah, I have to extend the barrel if I want to actually use up all the powder. That's a little better. Now the maximum size will be the maximum we want. Let's say 83 millimeters of penetration isn't enough. Well, let's try 100. Okay, 105, that'll be sufficient. Maybe a little bit less. Oh, maybe a little bit less. Okay, there's the 100 I want. That's the shell I'm going to use. But for the first date, I recommend using 50. Default shell length is 400 millimeters, so 50 by 400. That's reasonable. And then if you want to have, I won't stress out about the length of the base and the barrel. That's more for aesthetics from everything I've seen so far. That may change with time. But I would adjust the base length and barrel length depending on how you want it to look. So if you wanted to have a conical barrel heading down to the actual barrel, do something like that. Or if you're doing a historical recreation, it has a collar on it that just sticks out, maybe you want to do something like that. Regardless, the important thing to note is this 95% burn off. There is this 50 millimeter by 400 millimeter shell requires 380 millimeters of barrel length total. That can be however you want. Minimum for these two sliders is 0.1 each for a minimum of 0.2. So, just wanted to make it easy. There's the minimum barrel length. Keep in mind, as you extend barrel length, don't worry about the burn off. Don't worry too much about the penetration. Note the dispersion. That is how many millimeters the round will vary. So if I am aiming at a point in the center of the screen, I shoot, the gun is at exactly the right convergence so that the shell will arrive on the sight at that range. This will vary up to 120 millimeters for every 100 meters traveled. So if the shell goes 300 meters, it could be up to 360 millimeters in any direction. So longer barrels have less dispersion. Burn off doesn't really matter too much. There is recently with the last patch, a change to the muzzle velocity. Used to be it would max out. Now it uses a logarithmic scale to calculate it. So here's our minimum, and it rapidly gets up to the 95% burn off. The rest of this slider is just that other 5% of unburned powder, giving it extra time to actually ignite and get the shell to go a little bit faster. And the muzzle velocity does affect the damage that you can see down there below. But for the purposes of this scenario, I'm looking at let's keep it short. I don't care too much about dispersion. We're going to be at pretty close range for an ambush. Thickness doesn't seem to do anything yet other than add weight, so use it for the aesthetics that you want your tank to look like. So we've designed a cannon. Ammo. How much ammunition do you want to carry and where? For a cannon like this that does 46 millimeters of penetration, I'm going to want mostly armor piercing. If I want it to be realistic, I'll have like 60 or 100 rounds total. For a scenario like this, I'm going to do like 30 rounds of armor piercing, 10 rounds of armor piercing high explosive. And I don't want any in the hull. That's me personally. If you are using very big shells, those shells will take up a lot of weight in the turret. And then you may want to move it down into the hull. Okay, that finishes out. Oh, muzzle brakes. Right now, they don't add any weight and they don't affect the gun stats. So again, use it for aesthetics. What do you want that looks good to you? And then the gunner side, but we'll take care of that later. I will skip mobility at... not entirely. We'll go through some basics on mobility and then we'll hit it after we, again, once we finish with the base, start to finish the tank. The powertrain. You have good tooltips here. As you can see, the twin transmission steers by varying the force to each track, so basically it'll downshift in the direction that you want to go, as each track has its own. So the driver uses that to turn the tank. Allows turning in place. Very smooth turn rate, usually, unless you're doing something crazy like a micro tank. Maintains speed in turns because the other track is still turning. With clutch braking, that track will disengage entirely. Or you can start braking it. And that's what will turn the tank, and so you'll lose more speed in the turns. Disadvantages? Twice as heavy for a transmission, which can matter. Functions poorly with a small number of gears. Having made a micro tank with twin transmission is very true. I would say you need at least 3 forward gears for the twin transmission to work. You can get it to work with less, but it is awkward, it is jerky, and it's not smooth at all. Clutch braking, disconnecting tracks from the engine, uses less space, cannot turn in place, dramatic slow on turns, or turns on slow. But if you take a look, that's almost a quarter ton, and 70 cubic centimeters. So for a first tank, I would recommend stay with twin transmission. It's better. Better overall. For specific purposes, you will want something more. Having gone through all these settings and the more recent patches, there are no advantages to any in particular. Choose for aesthetics. What do you want the sprocket that drives the tracks to look like? There are no options for sprocket mounts. Idler wheel, that is the opposite of the sprocket. And what do you want that to look like? It used to be this one weighed less, but that has been fixed. Should be a nice, even choice of what you want it to look like. Suspension. Now, here is a substantive difference. We go into tracks, you have two sub-menus here for layout and suspension. So in the suspension, there are no tooltips yet, although that should be coming soon. You have, let me adjust things here briefly. I don't want that. I guess we'll raise it up on the suspension. You have what is a large torsion bar. You have what is a small torsion bar. So if you want your tank to sit up high and you want to take that big torsion bar, note that is almost 3/4 of a ton heavier than the lighter torsion bar. So if you have an extremely heavy tank or you want one that it sits high, I would recommend the heavy torsion bar. Otherwise, I would recommend the light torsion bar, unless you either don't want to have to deal with adjusting these values to get tweak the suspension at all, and you're having trouble with torsion bars, or you want it for aesthetics or recreation. You have the bogies. Don't worry that it removes the forward, that's fine. You have two kinds. You have the light bogies and the heavy bogies. The suspension work by this sleeved hydraulic moving back and forth, and they kind of flex downward and upward, and that's mounted on the hull. Note, the bogies are heavy, so it might be better for a heavier tank. If you're trying to make a light tank, you might be stuck with the torsion bar, but the default settings are fair enough. But the difference between the two bogies, the light bogies, 400 kilonewtons per meter, or 400 kilonewton meters of torque. Specific weight is 45.1, and then 898.5, roughly twice as stiff. So I would select, what do you want your tank to have? I'm going to go with the heavy torsion bars. I haven't really used them much. It is heavier, but I plan on making a larger tank this time. The return rollers, which are these dealies here. And we'll make those look like little fan wheels. The mounts, there's no options yet. Then you have the tracks themselves. Used to be, this one was the lightest, which it looks like it might be again. Seeing weight changes there. It might be changing something else on the tracks. It is such a minor amount that unless you're making a super micro tank, it shouldn't matter. Choose one that looks right for what you want to do. You have kind of an old style slatted track. You have a rubberized track, and then you have a linkage track. Pick one that looks right, you think is right for your tank. Engine. There are advanced settings. If you don't want to do that, this being the first tank, look at heavy, medium, light for the basic. You can it used to give slightly different values if you clicked through it multiple times. Looks more fixed. Things to take note of are how heavy is it, how much space does it use. So I'm just going to go with the medium size engine. Transmission, don't worry about it. Fuel. If you go into the engine advanced tab, fuel consumed for distance traveled of 100 kilometers. You don't have to change the fuel at all, but 248 liters for a 100 kilometer range. Okay, you don't need 800 liters of fuel in the tank. It is heavy and it takes lots of space. So let's use that 248 that the engine is giving us. And that frees up a bunch of space, lightens up the tank, and puts it about where it wants. Last thing to choose is you want these fenders. You'll note that it's intersecting the track. We can fix that easily enough by either adjusting the angle to allow it, and also turn them off entirely. We'll leave them on for now, like section length of 1 meter. Width is fine for now. Actually, I'll turn it off because I'm going to be adjusting things and turn it back on at the end. That takes you through the mobility options in the basics. Oh, also you have a choice of what the fenders look like. Only the middle. Let me turn it back on. You have kind of a skirted, and then you have the sectional, and then you can place segments if you need to. Which, note, a lot of components you can hold down shift and scroll wheel, and it will resize the component. And then, as we saw in the settings, Q and E to rotate. Right click to let go of the object. You have to select something else. And then you have riveted panels that you can stick on as spaced armor, have various shapes and sizes, like how they got the Matilda look, and so on and so forth. Moving on to the base. Now we get to the meat and potatoes. The basic shape is not bad at all. Something I might recommend at first, if you want to not have to tweak it later, figure out what you want these values to be right now. Because it has a default set that's more for mid and late war tanks. Because this red means it's unlikely to be penetrated by guns of this era. That doesn't mean it won't be. You note that blue, that means it's a ricochet. Most likely to ricochet. So keep that in mind. You'll note that this bar up front changes color. So here the effective thickness is 43 millimeters because the hit angle is at 45 degrees. Here it's at 33 degrees and effective thickness is only 36 millimeters. This allows you to quickly see, oh, I have that sloped enough to bounce anything as long as I have the hull angled and it's not a side shot, things like that, as well as, okay, if I want the side armor to be effective at 30 degrees. Okay, well, let's get this to the front. Right there. We'll get to about 60 degrees, and then we can adjust it so the armor is effective for that side. But we'll get to that later. For now, for this scenario, I just trimmed it down. You can save a little bit of weight. Like, we don't need belly armor. Roof armor, 20 millimeters is fine. The front armor, make it 40. And just pick something. Here's your top and bottom. 10 all the way through. 40 on the front. 30 on the sides. Rear, 20. And you don't need to worry about individual settings. We don't need. It's not that important. Click on shape. Go back to turret. Go back to armor. And same thing. Ring we'll do it 40. Side we'll do it 30 like the hull. Roof will be 20. No, we did 10. Then the front will be 40. The rear will be 20. And the sides are already 30. So there you go. Same applies there. You can also rotate the turret. That becomes important. And then back to the shape. For me, I like to start with the turret. You have the forward offset, which for a balanced tank in the center works just fine. You have a side offset, or some of those designs that we saw historically. You have the turret traverse rate. You're going to have a hand cranked turret, which as you can see is pretty slow, but pay attention to the weight. Okay, doesn't take that much for 80 Newton meter work. But it also takes internal space. If I slide it up a bit, it takes quite a significant amount of space. So get something that works. 20 degrees is pretty comfortable. Even 15 degrees is comfortable if you have 100% efficiency for the crew, which we do right now. Turret ring. You can raise up the turret, lower it down. The ring diameter, which the game will not allow you to have a turret ring that is larger than the turret itself. So this upper bound is limited by the length and width of the turret. If I were to lower this enough, you'll see the turret ring starts to shrink, because 0.8 plus the length of the front plus the length of the back is not enough. Now, if you want to keep it simple, don't mess with the angles. Keep the default shape and just rough the lengths and widths and diameters. So for this one, I'm going to raise up the mid. I am going to balance out the back with the front, so 0.5 meters on either. The width, at this point I'm going to go to firepower, I'm going to go to gun mount. I want to pick a light mantlet. Some of these, if you're making a tank destroyer, they do not have azimuth. Get into that in a second. That's sideways traverse. This one does. And it's right there. And we can add an azimuth traverse. That allows you to move the barrel left and right. You don't need that if you're on a turret. Does this one have one as well? Yes. as does that one. The slot mantlets do not. Things also to know is you need a gunner sight. This one has an integrated gunner sight right there. So does this one. So I tend to like using this one, because it already has the gun sight in it. Our barrel is already there. And this will help me to figure out, okay, do we need a turret that's this big? I mean, it's a 3-man turret, so we do need a lot of people in it. But should I shrink the width of it, or the length of it, or the aesthetics I want? I'm going to shrink the width. And that's close enough for our purposes. And doesn't look half bad of a turret. Things to note. The turret basket. The wider it is, the more space it takes inside the hull, because the basket is inside the hull. So you can make oversized turrets simply to allow you to save space in the hull, and vice versa. And that works. Shrink the turret ring by 100 millimeters. And then widened the turret back out. The turret overhangs by 10 centimeters. Now, if we look at the hull, we have way more space than we need. The easy way to handle this, without getting into all the armor angles and such, just stick with length and width. And aesthetically, let's go for 2 meters wide. We'll shorten it. You know what? I'm not going to go too far. We'll have extra space. I don't care. It is fine. We have a tank down. Has a rough shape for hull and turret. Going back to mobility, we have our powertrain suspension. This basically takes the torsion bar. You can see it right here, and this is one of the reasons I chose the larger one, because it's a lot more visible. And the rest angle allows you to raise it up and down. For the purposes of the first scenario, just making your first tank, not important. The length and diameter of the torsion bar, not important for a tank of this size. We could reduce it even. Damper, not needed. It's all good, nothing too crazy. Big things to note. You want to relocate the sprocket or the idler. You can grab them and drag them. And also use the sliders. Just entering in generic values back. That was at 0.3. It's not that big a deal. Other things to note. Do you want return rollers or not? Do you want the sprocket in the back or the front? I want mine in the back, especially with an exposed casing like this. Having the transmission able to be penetrated by a tank shooting at the front is not the best idea. Other options, you have interleaved, which gets the road wheels overlapping with each other. For your first tank, I won't recommend doing that, because you have to reduce the number of wheels per axle, or it looks funny. The big things are, Do you want a different diameter than what was given to you? And I think we will. We'll raise the tank up a little bit to say 0.75. And the spacing. You'll note we lost that front wheel. I would do the spacing just so we have 5 wheels again. And then all the way at the bottom is your return rollers. That's the other one to look at. And I think right there makes sense. Because there's a return roller between each wheel. Don't have to worry about the rest of the settings. We'll go over that in another video. Engine, we already did the basics. Transmission should be fine. There's a lot of tweaking and it hurts my sensibilities. Other things to note. If you want to add an exhaust or a vent, those are in the engine tab. So we can put one on here. We hit X, mirrors, and we have a couple vents for our engine. And I can put my iconic stovepipe, but this time it is really meant for the engine. Make it a little bit smaller. There we go. And then fuel, if you want external fuel, these are 45 liter? I thought they were 50. Yeah, you can add external tanks and it adds external capacity. So you can have extra fuel sitting outside the tank. It'll be exposed, vulnerable. And this is like a fuel port. It doesn't weigh anything. Add it for aesthetics. Then we have our fenders, the auto-generated ones. Do the forward offset, we make it go all the way forward and cover the idler wheel a little bit. Back to firepower, and we can things to other things. We did the power traverse. There is an elevation torque that allows you to elevate the gun barrel up and down 3.2 degrees per second. Note it changes the weight and the space used. Later on it can be quite heavy and space hungry. Oh, and if you wanted to change the base armor of the mantlet, you can. The max depression is important. If you can't depress the gun at all, to point it downwards, that's going to bug me, so I'm going to move the turret forward a 1/4 meter. So if you can't depress the gun at all, look at the setting in here under gun mount. Now we have the gunner sight in there. We still need a driver's sight. All the sights are in the crew. I'm going to throw on a commander's cupola. Crank it down. Viewport for the driver. We'll put him right there. You can add in antennas, which are actually functional now, I believe. And this is like a wire loop antenna. Stowage boxes, we'll stick one on the back of the turret maybe. Like that. That's a little bit big, I think it's clipping through. We'll make it a little bit smaller. That works. Crew hatches. We'll put an ill-advised frontal one for the driver, just below his viewport, so he can bail out quickly. Commander's cupola works for the turret. So let's make a separate one for the gunner that can just flap open, since we can't use a rear one. So 2 people can bail out at the same time. We'll move the commander's cupola over just a little bit. You know, kind of see the bubbles of where the people are. I'm gonna add a pair of headlights. We'll put them on the fender. Then you can have all kinds of various hatches and doodads. Like we will put... No way to make that look good, is there? Oh, yeah, we can do it like that. A slot for passing ammo through. Trenching tools. If I can get it to go green. Alright, we'll put it down there. And then hatches and bolts and stuff. We can even add a machine gun, which is not functional right now. I have a few options. We'll just add one right in the center. It shouldn't block the viewport too much. Let's get it so it doesn't interfere with the hatch either. And there we go. We have a basic tank. There's a lot of optimization that can be done, but as a first tank, this works. Save it, test it. You see, it moves. Turret traverses. The tank can turn. We tap shift, scroll wheel, left click. We have penetrated our first tank. I'm not used to the luxury of such great firing rates. There goes one tank. I think that one's down. One up here. There we go. One more up there. Or is that one down? Oh, it was still alive. This fast firing rate, I've used half of the available ammo, so I might want to increase the ammo stowage. I'm noting some changes to be done to the engine and or the transmission right now. You have plenty of space in the hull. We could have used a heavy engine. But for an interwar tank, being kind of sluggish and slow is normal. There we go. Take some finesse to learn how to drive a tank. As I stated before, WASD for forward, backward, left and right. Keep in mind the tracks have to have traction to be able to work. And how the suspension is handling things can impact how much traction you have on the left and the right sides, and that could be accounting for some of what you see. And I think the suspension is a little bit stiff for this tank, which is not surprising. I use the heavy torsion bars. Still getting some suspension travel. As I said, 15 degrees for turret traverse with 100% efficiency for the crew. That worked out pretty well. Oh, hit the berm. Hit the berm. High. High. Blink. Got you in the side. Oh, took us out. These guys are just sitting here. While I'm at it, let's take a look. Command team. Follow me. Alright, you just let go of the T button. Hit the rock this time. There's our tank. If you see a white stripe on the barrel, that means that tank got the killing shot on another vehicle. So it will add up stripes. Okay, they are actually following. Yeah, it's just cycling between gears too frequently. So many optimizations I can see already. But as you can see, just roughing a tank fairly quickly, without getting too much into the details, you'll make something that is effective. That was non-penetrating. There's a penetrating hit. There's a penetrating hit. You saw the orange cursor kind of blowing out a little bit, and it was gray for the non-penetrating. Now you can hit enter to go to the next mission immediately. Escape to exit to the main menu. If you're like me, you don't necessarily save every single time. You can still press spacebar, go back, and save your design. I know we did this time though. And there you go. That's how you can make your first tank quickly and easily and get it all done, roughed up, and ready to go. With that, I'll call this episode to a close. I thank you for joining me. Hope you enjoyed as much as I did. Please leave a comment, let me know what you think, and I will see you all next time. Take care, everyone.